Hello, this is Dr. Bob Evans, and welcome to our podcast, Parental Alienation from Couch to Courtroom and Beyond. We will discuss the resisting and refusing dynamic, commonly referred to as parental alienation, how you'll know it's happening in your case, and what can be done about it. Parental alienation can cause stress and trauma in high-conflict cases. These podcasts focus on how attorneys and mental health professionals can support families and children. This episode, I'd like to again turn to the Woodalls from the United Kingdom. This time, Nick Woodall, and that's Woodall, Woodall, posted an article. They do this every month, by the way, and encourage you to take a look at them. But this one was a month or so ago, and it's entitled The Alienated Child, Responding to Cases of Post-Separation Parental Rejection. And Nick starts out by talking about how some people are arguing that the allegations of parental alienation are used by fathers to deflect attention from domestic abuse. In other words, the abusive father uses the parental alienation as a distraction for the courts. Frequently, you'll find arguments going the other way, where mothers are using parental alienation to detract from domestic abuse. So they use domestic abuse as an argument to hide the parental alienation that they're executing. And so it goes back and forth. And you know what? And in fact, there are people that do that, and that happens. I don't know that it's the majority of the cases, but it happens occasionally. I think when we can drill down and we do some investigation in these cases, we find that there are enough evidence to suggest that the parental alienation is going on in these cases. And it's a lot more frequent than people want to admit, especially the courts want to. Lawyers want to come in and say, well, this is just a minority of the cases. That's not exactly my experience. But anyway, the courts tend to shift or sift through, these conflicting he said, she said arguments in order to determine what supposedly is in the best interest of children. Frequently, the courts are going to hear children who will venomously reject a parent. And so it really places a lot of confusion and responsibility on a court to try and figure out what's really going on in a case, because you got he said, she said going on, and you got the child saying things. Frequently, you're going to hear children talk about the harm that they experienced and the fear that they have toward a rejected parent. And so courts, always in an abundance of caution, protect the child. And so we have to take a look at what's really going on with some of these children, what's actually happening, so courts maybe get a better understanding about this phenomenon. And one way that the Woodalls are saying things like, let's look at alienation as a child's resistance or hostility toward a parent. And it's not justified, because that's alienation, and is the result of some psychological manipulation by the other parent. Well, that's clearly parental alienation. One parent is manipulating the child to allegedly fear a targeted or rejected parent. Alienation definitions sort of can vary from time to time. And it's an old phenomenon, and you probably heard us talk about it, or you're familiar with the idea that back in the 1940s, a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst by the name of Wilhelm Reich, he referred to one of the divorcing parents engaging in denigrating behavior as a means of alienating, this is a quote, alienating the child from the other parent. That's how far back this phenomenon goes. It actually goes back into Greek literature, but that's a topic for a different episode. And so what we find is that the more recent discussions, if you will, came about by Richard Gardner back in 1985. And published in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychoanalysis and Dynamic Psychiatry. And he basically talked about the conscious, sometimes unconscious or subconscious factors within one parent that contribute to a child's alienation from the other parent. And Gardner identified 8 behavioral signs in children that he labeled parental alienation syndrome. And, you hear about, about these 8 symptoms, and we've covered them in other podcasts. They're in my trainings. It's in the literature. It's a very common discussion about what's going on with alienated children. Another topic, kind of interesting, a quick aside, is that what you find in the courtroom frequently is attorneys representing the alienating parent will attack the expert witness who's trying to help the court understand about the phenomenon of parental alienation. That attorney will attack the expert because they might say, well, what do you think about Richard Gardner? And then they basically try to assassinate Richard Gardner's character in the courtroom and then basically discredit the expert for saying, well, this is what Richard Gardner says, blah, blah, blah. And because you're an affiliate, an associate, an advocate of Richard Gardner, therefore you're a bad guy. And I can't tell you how many times that has happened to me. And I will devote a podcast one of these days about the arguments that are being used to discredit Richard Gardner, and then, of course, used to discredit the expert who basically believes Richard Gardner had some kind of professional abilities that should be adhered to. But that's a different topic, and we'll talk about that at another time. But what we're finding is that people are starting to recognize alienation as a relational problem in which the child unconsciously utilizes the maladaptive defense of psychological splitting. And I talked about that in my last podcast. And this is in response to the situation, the relational situation that they're finding themselves in. And that is a very frightening and overwhelming environment. Basically, according to the Woodalls, and I don't disagree with what they're saying, is they're saying that this approach recognizes that every case has a unique dynamic to it. It requires a different level of assessment to not only identify the specifics and the particulars about a particular case, the causes for the child's rejection, etc., but also relative to the treatment that has to be implemented in order to help this family. So it's important to recognize that what we're really dealing with here is the child's maladaptive response to basically a very unmanageable psychological situation in a disillusion or a post-separation environment. And it requires changes with determining what is really in the best interest of the child by looking just beyond the narrow confines of who's taking care of the child from a daily perspective and contact. In other words, this is not about custody. This is not about who should really have quote-unquote possession of the child, but looking more in terms of what's going to be the best kind of treatment for this child in order to basically protect the child. And one of the things, and I know I talked about this early on, and Dr. Stephen Miller talks about this, that a serious problem is the child's basically employing an unconscious mechanism to enable them to exist in this environment in order to remain in a relationship and in close proximity to the child's attachment figures, and that's the mother and the father. It's not just one parent. The child must be recognized as what's going through the child is what was referred to as an attachment trauma. And you're seeing more and more in the literature now about how this phenomenon is more of a traumatic experience for children. I have to understand that attachment is a psychobiological connection that develops between infants, obviously, and children and their primary caretakers, and it provides the relational template for the child as it grows and it reaches into adulthood. The attachment bond provides the child with a safe haven in which it can rely on their primary caregivers for comfort at times whenever they feel threatened or unsafe. And divorce and dissolution of relationships are a big cause of a child's feeling threatened and unsafe. And the attachment provides the child with a secure base in order to have a foundation from which they can develop their own coping skills. And once that attachment gets disrupted through a dissolution, and then ultimately through the implementation of alienation, the child is then really starting to experience a traumatic event. So in the early part of an infant's lives, they basically maintain physical proximity to their attachment figures. Well, everybody knows that. However, in time, the child begins to explore the world around them, and they start to break away. They start to exert their autonomy, their independence, and that's a healthy thing. And what happens, we find, is that when children are threatened and their security is threatened, then they don't do the external world exploration as much as they should do in order to develop their autonomy. So Bowlesby, who basically coined the terminology, and we find within attachment theory, he basically emphasized that the primary status and the biological function of intimate emotional bonds between individuals, the making and maintaining of which are basically postulated to be controlled by the child's central nervous system. Regardless of the quality, this is really interesting, because what you see in court cases, an attack on the, quote, quality of the parent-child relationship, Bowlesby notes that regardless of the quality of the parent-child relationship, children are biologically hardwired to form and maintain an attachment relationship with their caregivers. Given the instinctual nature of the attachment process, any breach in an attachment relationship or in the attachment confirming behaviors in the child, they have to be regarded as being maladaptive and therefore harmful for the child. What we find in cases where children are actually abused or neglected, they want to maintain that attached relationship. What we see in alienated children who claim to be fearful of a parent because they're so harmful and dangerous to that child is the child wants to avoid that relationship. That is counter-instinctual. We talked about this with Dr. Steve Miller way back. Dr. Miller refers to this as counter-instinctual behavior. In other words, children don't reject their parents. It just doesn't happen unless somebody's manipulating the child. And Gardner would say that in order for a child to reject that parent, there would have to be such a horrendous relationship, has to be so physically harmful to that child, that that child would shy away from that parent and be fearful of that person. And that happens very rarely. So what Woodall's talking about is in these post-separation families, the child has to find a way to maintain their attachment in this fractured environment rather than in a unified environment where an intact family would normally be present. And so when the post-separation dynamics within a family don't present significant obstacles, the child is usually able to switch its attachment focus with only minimal impairment. When a child is in a family where there's a amicable divorce and both parents can get along, they both communicate, they both help the child develop, then the child thrives and a child experiences very few issues. But when the post-separation dynamics put pressure on the child's attachment system, transition may become difficult and in some cases impossible for the child to achieve. The child then becomes psychologically split and as a consequence alienated. It is the splitting defense that poses the greatest threat to the child's well-being and their development. In other words, the child has to adapt to this unnatural environment of a divorce, of a dissolution, and the only way the child ultimately can survive is to reject one of the parents. And it's interesting because a psychiatrist basically refers to this splitting as a schizoid defense mechanism that protects the child's ego. And this is very psychodynamic language here, but it seems to be pretty relevant. In other words, this defense mechanism protects the ego when it is confronted with competing and irreconcilable feelings. Irreconcilable feelings is the child's attached to both parents. The child loves both parents. Now, all of a sudden, the child's denied access to one of the parents and then is informed through false memories, through misinformation, through bad-mouthing. We have all those strategies. The child's then told how horrible, terrible this one parent is and that their own survival is to reject that parent. So the child can really not even be able to find its way to get back to its a normal attachment to both parents. and basically they have to split off and deny the attachment bond to one of its parents. It's a survival mechanism. And in psychodynamic thought, it's a form of adjustment. It's primarily an internal process, but it's witnessed in the external world through the child's rejection of one of the parents. And there's a very robust psychological history and research and theories that go on in terms of talking about how the child basically develops a false self of never having had a positive relationship with a parent, with whom, of course, that's totally absurd. Alienation cases will typically come before a court in the context of a parent seeking to restore a relationship with the child, i.e. the rejected parent wants that child back, and the child is rejecting them. The intuitive response is to seek to identify the problem in the child's relationship with the parent and what did that parent do and that they are rejecting. And in most cases, the child will offer a whole list of complaints, depending on how severe the alienation is, and the allegations that justify their rejection of that parent. This justification is going to range from very trivial kinds of things. I had one case where a kid said the father made him eat broccoli, to where they make allegations of physical and sexual abuse to the point where it's almost beyond reality. And so whether or not they're justifiable can be considered to be a reason for children's behaviors, a court has to make that decision. And then there's a big movement going on right now is we have to listen to the child. And so the child's going to have these false memories. They're going to have these allegations. And for some reason in family court, you're not necessarily innocent until proven guilty. In family court, frequently you're guilty until proven innocent. And courts always take the high road of trying to protect the child from a alleged abusive parent. They don't know. They don't know what the truth is. So you can't blame the courts in many cases. So a case in which a child's rejection of a parent has a justifiable cause is not a case of alienation. If a child has generally been abused brutally by a parent, neglected by a parent, that's not necessarily a case of alienation. But when there's no demonstrable or justifiable cause, there's no evidence, okay, more importantly, than the child showing signs of psychological splitting, it's highly likely that the rejection lies not in any dysfunction in the child's relationship that they are rejecting, but in their relationship with the parent to whom they are aligned. In other words, the problem has more to do with the child's relationship with the favored or alienating parent than it does with the rejected parent. And that's what's missed very frequently. In other words, people aren't looking at the relationship between the favored or alienating parent as much as they are looking at the rejected parent's relationship with the child. And it's almost a deliberate distraction. And of course, attorneys representing the alienating parent will facilitate that distraction to the point where they'll not only attack the rejected parent, but then they attack anybody who comes in as an expert to help the court understand about this phenomenon. Research is suggesting that alienated children lack relational perspective and articulate highly polarized views about their parents, one parent being the embodiment of everything that is good and safe, and the other parent is the embodiment of all that is bad and dangerous. And again, we know that that's one of the phenomena, that's one of the symptoms, if you will, of parental alienation. A child will just have nothing bad to say about their favorite parent and have nothing good to say about the rejected parent. So counterintuitively, this is a contrast to children who are found to have been maltreated, who typically perceive the abusive parent in an ambivalent manner. In other words, what children who are abused, they want to help that parent change. They love that parent. They want to maintain a relationship with the parent. It's not that they are fearful of that parent. So in understanding what may lead a child to become hyper-aligned to one of its parents, we have to look at the interpsychic relationship between the child and the parent to whom they have become pathologically aligned, while some cases feature what's referred to as strategies by the aligned or favored parent. At least many are rooted in the interpersonal and unconscious relationship between the child and that parent that they have become bound to. So overt strategies may include making a child believe that they have been harmed by the other parent, causing the child to feel that they are unsafe in the other parent's care, undermining the other parent's role, involving the child in hostile narrative about the other parent and their wider family. Children reject the extended family. They reject aunts, uncles, grandparents who never did anything negative to the child, but simply have been associated with the targeted or rejected parent. They involve the child in adult relationships, encouraging the child to make false or fabricated allegations. And so the child becomes hyper-aligned, including inducing abandonment threats and shutting and psychological terrorism, emotional dysregulation and psychological decompensation, enmeshment. These are all terms that have been found in the literature that what's going on with these children. Role corruption. And it goes on. And leakage of unresolved trauma. Leakage, in other words, the trauma shows up in other areas in the child's life. I'm going to stop here for now. What's happening is what the Woodalls will talk about is how we have to do an individual assessment of families. We have to uniquely work with both parents, the targeted parent as well as the favored parent and the child, to help resolve the situation. We have programs in the United States that are doing that very thing. Have programs that they do separate the child from the favored parent for a period of time in order to reunite the child with the rejected parent, and it takes some time in some cases for the parent to get back, the family to get back together, all dependent on stopping the abuse from the favored parent that the parent-child is putting the child through. That's what has to happen. It's not just a separation from the favored parent, but it's that parent has to understand that what they're doing is child abuse and it has to stop. And that's a tall order for folks. So we have to take a look at our system, our legal system, to see how we can implement this kind of solution in a more efficient and effective manner than I think we have been. So I thank you for attending and talk to you soon. Thank you so much for joining us today. For more information on this topic, please visit www.drbobevans.com or www.naopas.com. We offer classes for both legal and mental health professionals to help educate them on the signs and strategies of parental alienation and how to move forward for a healthier environment for the children of divorce. Please visit www.naopas.com and sign up for our courses and use coupon code PODCAST for a 50% discount.